Good evening. It's on. Hi. Please take your seats. Um, First of all, I'm April Gornick. I'm one of the church's founders with Eric Fischel, my husband, and I would like to acknowledge that we are on unceded land belonging to the Montaukett and Algonquin tribes. That's first order of business. Second order of business is please check your phones and make sure that you have actually silenced them. You might be thinking, I remember I did that, and then, whoops. And may I ask if anyone is here for the first time at the church, or have you all been here before? Raise your hands. No? Oh, yay. All right. Thank you, loyal and staunch friends, for being here. I have the distinct and particular honor of introducing our speaker tonight, who is Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Philip Schultz. And I have to say, just on the subject of poetry generally, and why I'm so excited to hear him tonight in particular, although I've always enjoyed listening to him read and speak. When things get very, very, very hard for me, as they do for everyone in our lives, when I feel that I've suffered a great loss, when I feel a kind of an abandonment, and when I feel overwhelmed by circumstances that are making me, in some fashion and for some reason, grieve, even though I'm an artist, I'm a painter, I immediately turn to poetry. It has a kind of an ineffability in the complexity of the way that it delivers messages that are usually open-ended and just allow you to be where you are, that I find appropriate to grief and appropriate to having to try to make steps towards acceptance of a situation and also comfort. And I take the comfort from the complexity that it inherently has. And so one reason that I'm thrilled that Philip is speaking tonight is because I love his poetry and I know that it's going to feed my soul. And I hope that it does for you also. A little background, I mentioned that Philip won the Pulitzer Prize. This was for a book that he wrote called Failure, and it was autobiographical and very revelatory and very generous. And he's also gotten, I can't even tell you how many awards. I started trying to memorize them today, and I thought, screw it, just... He's, the Lamont Prize and the Institute of Arts and Letters, and it just goes on and on and on. He's been widely heralded, and he's an incredible teacher. He's a very, very, very generous teacher, and if you ever are privileged to be in a workshop or a writing class with him, you'll be fully aware of why. And he is also a founder of a writing group, which has been going on forever in New York. So I don't know exactly what he's going to say to us tonight, but I am very thrilled to have him, and thank you so much for everything that you have done previous to this talk and what you'll be doing in the future. So welcome from all of us.
Well, I have a few prepared remarks to begin, and of course I've forgotten most of them, but I do want to take up on what April just said, that I'm sure we're all going through something, and there is something I found myself seeking, not relief, but a form of salvation in opening a door I open when I need to. And it's full of feelings, often raw feelings, often the kind of feelings I'm sure we're all feeling right now. And they're so prominent. They're like my wife Monica's birds that are all in the air, and they're all ancient. All our feelings are ancient, and there's comfort in knowing that they've survived, and we will too. And living amongst those raw feelings has a kind of salvation in them. These are all new poems from a new book, and I'm struggling to come up with a title. Right now it's just Something and Nothing, which is the long poem at the end. And one of the things, it's inspired by the Arshile Gorky painting, The Artist and His Mother, which I think for over 50 years I've been obsessed with. It's the cover of my first book and a sketch of the painting. And only in the last few years have I really understood why, and how much of my mother and her sacrifice I see in that painting. And so I've dealt with it in a long poem that I'll read sections of at the end. The other thing I want to say is the other discovery I've made recently is why people have been telling me for a long time that my work is visual. I've been very inspired by visual art. I have always been. There's something about visual art, painting in particular, sculpture, that I guess speaks to me the way April was saying poetry speaks to her. I never understood when they said visual. I thought they meant that I was a storyteller. But visual is imagistic and raw and profoundly felt. Okay, this is the first poem. Flesh. Flesh speaks by blushing, wrinkling, graying with age and grief, remembers each caress and what was felt for those who gave it. Sly, clairvoyant, and wise beyond its ecology, it never reminds us it is sacred, that its beauty is born of woman, knows resilience is its strength, that it can be flayed, blown apart, drained of its mother's breath, every ounce of youth and dignity, made to forget it is living tissue, and even then, the memory of its genius continues in each precious touch. I swear to you, it continues. Here's a poem that's called Suffering. It has something to do with a feeling people will recognize. Suffering. Hiding doesn't help. It will find you anywhere. Remind you of your every unpardonable act and word, every attempt to undermine its authority. Fear is its currency, distrust and blame its strengths. Seldom is it personal or original, never bankrupt of ideas on how to prevail. And yes, it has benefits, helping us distinguish between mere misery and abject wretchedness. And of course, it can be performed anywhere, in any position, while driving, clipping toenails, strolling absent-mindedly down the corridors of common sense. Its intelligence and devotion to detail, inexhaustible. Its abhorrence to good news, every flavor of sympathy, fondness of isolation, are renowned. A sanctuary for self-pity, repository for shame of every denomination. Your last loyal friend, it croons in your dreams. Give in, just sit there, listening to your anxieties resonate into a symphony of betrayals. Remain unadorned, invisible, and divided. Deny, postpone, strive after the unattainable, make a shrine of desire and instinct, forgive and believe in nothing but the magnanimous opacity of boredom and endless change. Free yourself of longing, it pleads, any notion of triumph. Forage alone in its endless forests of blindness and rage. Navalny. Sacrifice is an expensive word, an even more expensive idea. Imagine the cost of giving up everything for one's belief, loving your ideals more than yourself, suffering every kind of abuse day after day, the expense of such passion, such faith. Where does such strength of will, belief in the idea of goodness come from? Did Alexei A. Navalny wish to mentor the world, set an example history couldn't repudiate? Imagine the pride and satisfaction, the cunning, the delight and torment in destroying before the eyes of the world the conscience of his tormentors. Now it's our turn. Now we must summon the courage to at least ask what we would sacrifice, whether we deserve, can afford our freedom. This is called Crazy. It starts with a quote from Brighton Breitenbach, who is a South African victim of apartheid. He was white, but he went against the government and his brothers, and he was locked up and I think 10 years in solitary confinement. He was also a dear friend. He is a dear friend. I haven't seen him in a while. His quote is, "I believe that the torturer is as depraved by his acts as the one who is tortured," which I believe is something we should all keep in mind now. Last night, my wife came downstairs to ask if I was throwing a dinner party. Alone, I was arguing with something someone said 20 years ago, finally responding brilliantly. Recently, I stopped biting my nails, but still pick at my fingers, follow the beloved faces of my favorite dead for blocks on end. Everyone in my family kept secrets from themselves, such as why they all slapped themselves repeatedly. Uncle Jake stood at the toilet mirror, daring himself to try it again. Grandma once slapped Mrs. Tillum at Levy's Deli because God told her to. Father slapped mostly his fate. We all talked to ourselves so loudly, no one ever heard anything anyone else ever said. Asked why he used irony to describe a death camp, Tadeusz Borowski said, "A defense against intolerable pain, an admission of failure, because reality was a necessary illusion." Once over dinner, a friend described the indignities done to him and others by those of his God and race. How each night in solitary confinement, there was no air to breathe, nothing to grasp, distort, resist. For years, day after day, he walked inside his tiny cell, chanting the names of the dead. Why hadn't he gone crazy? I asked. Staring into the darkness of my being, he said, "What makes you think I didn't?" What's dark in my nature is also devious. At night, in the quiet of my cell, I practice the arts of solace, irony, and catharsis. Condone and forgive nothing, the past reminds me, not even the obscenity of truth, always a last slap in the face. At our school, we have a thing where we talk about the big picture and the little picture, and how a poem or a story is the little picture. And if it's going to mean anything to somebody other than yourself, it has to at least hint at or imply a big picture. And this poem, in a sense, comes out of it. I started thinking about how they don't like each other. The little story, the big story, and the little story. The little story is quite little, about the size of your house and street. Fixates on bank accounts, toothpaste, clean underwear, and what's behind the grins of neighbors and friends. The big story obsesses about what things mean, the day after tomorrow, why something is or isn't extravagant enough to satisfy its ambitions. The little story enjoys being taken for granted, misunderstood, and misplaced. Too often it forgets what its many grudges and mistakes were about, not to mention all its conceits. The big story wants to be feared, indulged, and thoroughly respected, if not believed, which is why it names its episodes reality, history, politics, and missed opportunities. The little story likes to complain to strangers at bus stops about its job, wife, and kids, how it constantly is being smothered by inorganic subtleties. The big story relishes resumes, privileges, and everything ever said or thought about fate. The little story abhors its own sour endings, ludicrous schemes, being left behind and forgotten. The big story worries about being big enough, especially late at night when its conscience wants to sleep. The little story mainly fears being swallowed by the big story, which fears only itself. Each agree on one thing, why the Tao asks us to think of the small as large, the few as many, and what it means by practicing eternity without essentially ever believing in anything at all. This is called the present moment, and we apparently have one. Dogs, I'm told, not by my dog, but our dog, but live in the moment. Therapists often tell us to try to live in the moment. That I've never found it particularly hospitable. And this deals with that. It starts with a quote from Arthur Schopenhauer. Life was never anything more than a present moment, always vanishing. Yes, an anxious, impulsive, aloof, slippery fish, always worrying about being understood and visible enough, forever blaming the past for imprisoning us in its temperamental grasp. Yes, we're its prisoners, it insists, refugees forever begging the future to rescue us. It's the reason why the past is always so angry, refuses to forgive any of our mistakes. Don't pretend you don't know who's speaking to you, it whispers in my dreams. I'm the poet, not you. The reason everything you write is irreverent, tenuous, riddled with duplicitous ambiguities, is ignorant of the difference between triumph and praise. Yes, I'm where all your courage, fears, and intuitions are hidden. The reason reality so often feels like a vortex of ravenous appetites. Please, it groans, stop pleading for attention, a little kindness. Nothing else can save you. For just one insatiable moment, be irritable, frivolous, embrace all your misgivings. the catastrophe of history in all its disguises. Bid farewell to the wrath of your blessings. Be wrong every other Wednesday. Unfasten the hair shirt of your sacrilege. Honor all your petty details. Appease your terrors and anxieties. Yes, revelation is my aim. Just this one time, please embrace each epic yearning. Be spiteful, rhyme. I have no idea what I meant by that, but it seems adequate that the present moment should rhyme. The art of wailing. It starts with a quote from Lao Tzu, the Chinese poet. He who shows himself is not conspicuous. The way is forever nameless. And I see a friend who actually volunteered for ambulances, and this is a poem that deals with that. Jim, older than me and apparently clumsier, is swearing as he bangs my stretcher against the back of the ambulance. Billy, the young driver, laughs as he gently slides me inside, where Betsy, a retired librarian my sons loved, recalls hearing me read a poem about pumpernickel that made her hungry. Let her, Jim says, and she'll talk you to death. Well, she says, you failed a few tests. No big thing, a stent or two, relax. Now we're running traffic lights, the wailing reaching all the way to high C. You'll get fentanyl, she sings, might be inspiring. Well, if he writes one, you'll be in it, he sighs. Your wife's sculpture is at the Nature Conservancy, she adds, where I also volunteer. Yes, well, I help out at 3 firehouses, he shouts. Don't get me started. I volunteer for nothing, my charity remembering everything. I love poetry, she sighs, but it gives me headaches. Hang in there, fella, Jim winks, we're almost there. Outside the back window, a flock of pink clouds spell out a line by Lao Tzu. Governing a large state is like boiling a small fish. Yes, if abused, both stink. Now the wailings inside and out, a medley of Dylan's rasping loneliness, Monk's joyous reckonings, Elvis rocking my jailhouse loose of all my precious bitterness. Oh, life, please forgive my stumbling back alley escapes into respectability, my endless cacophony of unleavened regret and longing. Please, 1 hour more of my wife and sons, glorious absurdity, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and making tragic mistakes, my being my own favorite pursuit. Oh, thank you for this beautiful, nameless, ungovernable, stinky, small, pink fish. This poem is in memory of Connie Fox, the wonderful painter, who lived here for many, many years with her husband, the sculptor Bill King. Yesterday, my wife and I said goodbye to a painter friend in hospice, a wonderful woman in her late 90s, who first came out here to the far eastern edge of Long Island in 1979 with her expressionist friend, Elaine de Kooning, whose husband, Willem, rode his bicycle past her house every morning calling, "Good morning, Connie, best of luck," where she met her husband, the sculptor Bill King, each obsessed with ripping the outspoken out of the known, the astonishing out of the everyday, the symphonic out of each trembling breath. Having suffered a stroke, she could now speak only in song, and with her daughter, Megan, we all held hands and sang, "I've been working on the railroad," a song she sang to Megan as a girl. After kissing her goodbye, my wife and I walked along the ocean under the same red umbrella she opened in her paintings. All those afternoons in her studio, revelation dancing from floor to skylight, color trembling inside whirling squares and sumptuous rectangles, her playing the fiddle and Bill the piano at our son's birthdays, her echoing laughter. If only I could have thanked her for her hours of light and ecstatic wings, her gift of passion for what lives on the edge of things. Now paradise will be seen the way it was meant to, one edgy red umbrella at a time. This is a poem based on a painting by Eric Fischl. It was a show of, and I was supposed to thank at the beginning, which I forgot, all my wonderful hosts, April and Eric and Kristen and Sherry. But this is a painting. It was a show of boxing. And let me say, what summed it up for me was a boxing ring built for one that I can't get out of my mind, because talk about where we all are now, right? I mean, we are up against a much bigger opponent, but in many ways, it's ourselves we have to rescue. I was very taken with this painting. It seemed to say an awful lot to me about my own relationship. It's certainly a comment on the relationship of an artist and art, but me too. The painting is called Broken Hallelujah, after Eric Fischl. Here he is, the artist as combatant, alone inside the darkness of his arena, his eyes staring at us, scalding our imaginations, daring us to enter the fever of revelation, the violence of vision. His hands anointed red, resting between rounds of agony and satisfaction, waiting for the exaltation to begin again. The blackness of his clothes sweeping us ever deeper into the frenzy of inspiration, the unforeseen. Seated beside him, tumbling woman, struggling to take flight, rise above being calamity's mistress, the ransom of history. The tools, easels, paper towels, color, canvas imploding into the nakedness of adoration. April in Paris, a fire in light. The woman standing behind him, swallowing her testimony, staring at the man imprisoned inside her story. Yes, paintings inside paintings, the formulas of passion, bloodied but unbroken, stretched across millenniums of crawling forever deeper into jubilation. The mortal core rendered visible, vulnerable. Yes, there, hidden deep inside his gaze, us, pleading for meeting, to be understood, forgiven for wanting to be touched by fate, and saved, yes, Lord, saved. And before the long poem, this is the last of the shorter poems. It's called something we're all familiar with. It's called Democracy. Starts with a quote from Plato. A charming form of government full of variety and disorder, dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. On this cold November evening, democracy and I are walking along the ocean, arguing about why everyone in my old neighborhood hated where everyone else came from, behaved as if hate was our faith, envy and prejudice our nature. Sometimes, after arguing, democracy and I hold hands, reminisce about a past we both believed loved us more than it does now. But not tonight. Tonight, it admits, it can be clumsy, even suspicious, occasionally cruel and overbearing. But remember, it hums, George Washington and Abe Lincoln thought I was worth dying for. Plato believed my soul is immortal and therefore indestructible. Yes, I cry, but he also saw you as the tyranny of the ignorant majority, a collision of the just and the jaundice, the frenzy of the marketplace, preferred an aristocracy of philosopher kings. Still, we agree, a splendid idea about passion, reason, and change, protecting oneself against one's ignorance and greed, the justice of one's fists, the technicolor kingdom our dreams live in. Yes, democracy and I lament. Here we are again, at war with the delirious and self-obsessed, teetering on a precipice, singing a song half swallowed and off-key, riddles wrapped in a theory hidden in a paradox, about the mind's hunger for something as redolent and willfully unremitting as dignity, as hopeful and curiously radical as happiness. And please bear with me, as tormented and ever fleeting, as magnificently surprising and pleading and pleasing in its reach as, yes, say it, freedom. This next poem is going to be an introduction to the longer poem I'm working on that deals with Gorky and my mother. And let me just say, I first saw the Gorky painting when I was at a writing retreat, and I opened it and was mesmerized and had no idea why. I didn't know what his story was. I didn't understand that he and his mother and two sisters were on the death march during the Armenian genocide, and his mother, in order to feed them, starved herself to death and later died in his arms. And there was something about this painting that I knew nothing about that story, but I saw in their faces the cost it was to the painter and what he was showing, revealing about himself and where he was going in himself, daring to go in himself. That included me. And I wrote a poem, and it was in my first book, and the cover of my first book was Viking didn't want to spring for the color, so they let me do the sketch, but that was my cover of my first book. And all these years, I always thought I'd return to it, and I have finally. Here's a poem that pretty much started my doing it. It's called Sacrifice. After my sister was stillborn, Mother was told it was dangerous to try again, but she did, happily. After Father died, she told me stories about how, 1 week before their wedding, he lost everything and asked to move into her mother's house for a few months and stayed 20 years. How, when her teachers came to her house to plead for her Orthodox father to let her stay in school, she was brilliant, wrote like an angel. He sent them away. Education, he said, was wasted on girls. Half her life a filing clerk, the other half counting coins for my father's vending machines, disappointment, the salt she soaked her feet in each night. At her Alzheimer's ward, she showed me a big black book in which she kept every scrap of my existence sealed in plastic. I was the one thing she did right. she said. Lillian, Lilith, her namesake, the first woman on earth before Eve, exiled for believing she was Adam's equal, from which the word, the idea, lullaby, derives, like the ones she sang to me at night about being strong and good, surviving the bitterness that lives in us like bad dreams. Sometimes I walk the house at night the way she did, looking for the strength to undo all the hurt and shame, be a little more of what she so gladly sacrificed everything for. And this is the long poem, or sections from it, 3 sections from it. It's the title, Something in Nothing, derives from a quote from Schopenhauer. The world is driven by blind, dissatisfied will, seeking satisfaction, the cause, purpose, and essence of something. And I should add, fate is a character. Fate has all kinds of opinions. The same spiteful, persnickety fate that many years later in the library of the writing retreat where I wasn't writing opened a volume of modern paintings to the molten ochre faces, unfingered hands, and possessed eyes of a flower-clutching boy and his mother floating in spectral abstraction. Yes, the sentience, the hieroglyphic splendor of Arshile Gorky's The Artist and His Mother, which suddenly was speaking to me in the voice of a librarian, asking if I wanted to borrow the book I was so taken with. It was closing time. Yes, the dark anathema, the want, the pain in their eyes, peering out of the butchery of the death march of the Armenian genocide, designed to kill every man, woman, and child, that Gorky, his sister Vartush, their mother Shushan, and 2 half-sisters survived. When to feed them, this mother starved herself, dying 7 years later of starvation in her son's arms. Yes, the delirium, the seething that greeted us from every porch, front yard, and angry, sullen garden in our old neighborhood. The ungodly wars and Holocaust obliterations these evacuee neighbors refused to survive. Yes, there, inside their tiny, worried houses, frightened porches, the same grudging beliefs, arguing in Czech, Ukrainian, Irish, German, Italian, and Yiddish about who came here before anyone else, could invent the best American persona, justification, and finally, what being here meant, really meant, as if knowing was owning the will to achieve something other than dread. Yes, meant owning the gangrenous truth that now scalded Mom's blue eyes when she opened Grandma's front door and walked back inside. When my father died, lost everything, we had to return to live in the inner city in upstate New York. And my mother had her own place for only 2 years of her life. In the new backyard snow this morning, in the sycamores leaning ever closer, in the big walloping ocean wind and high morning sky unfolding ever so gently, in the smell of coffee downstairs, in the hands of my wife making it, the simmering deliverance, the unbridled light, we wearing masks after months of lockdown sought on my birthday, January 6, 2021. In our local museum sculpture garden, where from the hazardous assemblage of apes, parrots, Venuses, and that liar of liar, Mr. Pinocchio himself, all spread over a tractor's ruthless rake, the cavernous eyes of death's giant skull glared at us, out of the savage paradox of art's insurrection in Jim Dines' The Wheatfield, Agincourt, when suddenly our phones began wailing with an even more prolix assemblage, an even more savage kind of insurrection, which was now attacking our capital, because Pinocchio himself had told it to. And yes, now we too were staring out of death's cavernous eyes into the raging, infernal Jim Dine, Arshile Gorky, and Pinocchio himself personified. I was going to say, also to introduce this poem, that Gorky spent 10 years doing this painting. 10 years. And he was, like everyone else, he painted figures. He was figurative. He was literal. And somehow, in the two versions he did over 10 years, he couldn't finish the hands. The apron, which was a pinafore in the photograph, he couldn't make a pinafore. It became a cloud. In other words, abstraction took over. His staying with this for 10 years, I think, provided two sources of inspiration. One, it kept his mother alive. He was able to hold on to her. And second, he was creating a new art form, abstract expressionism. He was mutilating reality because reality is so fucking brutal. And he was creating that de Kooning later felt inspired him. Yes, here I am, all grown up and alone on my porch, bald with a small belly, eating chocolate ice cream while looking up at the tantalizing anonymity of the ancient, feckless stars, feeling besmirched and stealthy, yes, all wrapped up inside an illusion, wrapped inside a half-truth, me, fate, and reality, maybe existence too, all of us seeking a mother. Maybe because, as Schopenhauer said, misfortune in general is the rule. Yes, all of us seeking the origins of our originality, the cathedral of dreams that transforms wonder into transcendence, the nothing out of which something is made. Yes, all our precious forms of certainty, forever asking why we play such minor roles in our own dreams. Yes, what Plato called continual becoming and never being. The reason Pinocchio gave sabotage and calumny fists and legs to kick and tear asunder our most original idea. Yes, why he empowered his Philistines to disembowel truth and honor, render the righteous helpless because sometimes something gets stuck in nothing and can't free itself. Yes, please look up and see him sitting high on his golden throne of saturated greed, engorged and gloating, instigating the end of time spectacle of violence. Yes, our most sacred beliefs enslaved and forced to pray to the god of savagery, who wants everyone on their knees, unable to remember why, only yesterday, every field burned with meaning, every blessing a snow crystal one could shake and shake until deep in the whirlpool of our being, truth and honor rejoice, yes, rejoice in the splendor of unconditional freedom. I'm going to end with this one section. Yes, here I am ensconced in another dream fate has selected for me, this time cast off in Gorky's studio barn, intruding on a photo of him working on The Artist and His Mother, both of us now surrounded by shameless color, jumping over and under memory, holding hands with wistfulness, each worshiping only itself. And over there in the far corner of his fixation, the hard and brittle queen, mortality, conferring with her sacred friend, sacrifice, all spread over palpitating canvas. And there to the far right, look and see virtue confiding in vanity, vanity in deceit. Everywhere the willful obstructs the boorish, truth dancing with damaged pride. Yes, color magnifying and projecting itself on what remains of the genius of wonder, which, despite slaughter, starvation, and every kind of cruelty, endures. Yes, the genius of wonder continues to realize, hypothesize, and think with and without a why. Thank you.
I believe we're going to open the floor up for questions. So does anybody have any questions?
Not easy to ask questions.
May I ask why you chose to read an abridged version of your long poem?
Why I chose to read what? These?
An abridged version? It's not the entire poem?
Well,
you said?
the entire poem's 25 pages.
Ooh.
So that would be more than the entire reading by itself. So I just wanted those pieces that I felt pertinent to everything else I read and give some sense of what the poem is about. Yes.
You mentioned you don't have a title for your book. How does that evolve for you?
A title?
Yes.
Well, when I was writing Failure, I realized I was writing about failure and a lot. And even though it was the last title I thought would work or I wanted to call the book, I realized that to be true to the book, I had to call it Failure. It's not the most positive title. My editor at the time I remember, smiled at me and said she would think about it. And, but it was called Failure. It had to be called Failure. One possible, I'm going to risk this with Monica sitting here, but one possible title is called Spoiled Prayers, which again isn't very positive.
I thought Crazy was good.
You like crazy. Well, that's going to be the name of my final autobiography. Hi.
John Snow. Hi. Thank you. I just have a funny question. Does Pinocchio in all of your visions that I think we all share Pinocchio probably, is there a Geppetto?
That's who wrote the original, rather dark, the original story of Pinocchio, which if you read it, it's not for every kid. It's a very dark story. And he finally survives all this misadventures and turns into a boy. But that's the name of the Italian writer who wrote this original thing, which I read. And when this happened, and my wife were actually at the parish looking at that, and that broke out. It was before any of this, of course. So, yes.
Keeping with the Pinocchio Um, right now we're living in a time of AI and sort of a deep longing for an artificial intelligence to take over for us. And I'm always sort of struck by why. What is it about us that craves to create something that is better than us, but is artificial rather than self-improved, you know, rather than human, for example. And you know, Pinocchio was obviously a doll puppet longing to become human. Now we're human longing to become not. Do you have any sort of
Well,
further thoughts on that?
my first response was, we just elected an artificial intelligence. And I think, like fate and reality and all these big words, intelligence is very threatening. I mean, it's how we open a door and make ourselves lunch. It's how we survive, but it also is quite a burden. And it'll take us to outer space, and it creates wars, and it creates the kind of misinformation, disinformation that created the predicament that we're in, and proves people should vote for someone against their own self-interest. And I guess we want some relief from our own intelligence. We want maybe to have something to blame everything on. That it's artificial intelligence that will do all these marvelous things, already is doing all these GPSs and all these things, but I think right now we're at war with our intelligence. Look where it's taken us. I mean, it's a benefactor on one hand and a villain and demagogue on the other. So
we reach a point, maybe this is one of those critical points where the sort of conflict between those things. I'm sorry. The conflict between the intelligence, the suffering that comes from it, the knowing, the inability to control or to achieve, those kind of things, you know, create a grand moment of, you know, just inability to endure. It's in that space that it feels like artists have to operate in order to keep us from not becoming that, right? And increasingly more and more difficult to sort of, you know, find that way of articulating or pulling together. But, you know, it seems like the moment we're in now is one of such fracture that how you find the common, the shared, the excusable kind of thing, I think is really important. You know, your poems address that on a regular basis, but.
well, the thing that comes to me is in your painting, the cost of revelation is clear in that figure. It's very expensive, and it's a price many human beings, if not most, aren't willing to pay. And we want our artists to do it for us. We want the Gorkys and Van Goghs, when you think of the self-portraits, to do it for us, to show us revelation, because it's too hard to ask most people. I mean, when I work with students, some can and some can't ask that of themselves. So obviously, if you invent an artificial form of supplying answers and taking us there without what it leaves out in taking us there is the journey there, the price, which makes it all worthwhile. So we're just given the answers, or we're given the vacation, but without that journey, without that expression, without the bloodied hands that art always costs. I remember going to our son's graduation in Vermont, and seeing, for all kinds of reasons, things were going on, and I was happy about that, but I was tired and whatever, and there was a sunset. There was a gorgeous sunset. And I took a picture of it, and I sent it to April, and it reminded me of your paintings. And as soon as I did it, I was so soothed. I was in a completely different place. And I remember, because I was turning whatever I was feeling into art. And as nice as that sunset was, it was more comfortable to see it as a still life, as a painting. And I'd done this more than once. And it's the same thing. I think we turn to art at a time when we have no idea what's going on, and we're completely lost in a labyrinth in our own heads. And the path seems to be getting darker and darker, and art gives us light, if only for a moment, which is absolutely necessary now, isn't it? So,
Phil, I believe there is one more question over there.
okay.
Well, you ended so well, I really hate to ask a question after that. I do want to know, though, you seem to have a preamble or a quote or a little something from another wise person before you read, and I wonder whether or not that comes first, or does the poem preclude?
It's a great
I mean,
question.
do you always do that? Do you find something to write from, or do you write and then find something to fit it?
It's a great question. It's very personal with me. In this house in the inner city, and where all the neighbors were always fighting and hating one another, and not being able to achieve any little piece of the dream, I would escape upstairs to an attic. And in one room, there were boxes of girly magazines, and mostly nudist, Playboys. It was very, and that just made me feel worse, whatever was going on. I mean, it was exciting, but it was not satisfying. And in a box at the other part were all these first editions of Yeats and Hemingway and Lawrence and philosophy, Schopenhauer, a first edition of Schopenhauer's essays. And even though most of that was over my head, just the thought of me sitting down and going from one library to the next, it was so fulfilling. It was so satisfying. And I understood enough of what he was saying. He was speaking about the human will to attain, to reach for something. He also believed, his most famous book is called Studies in Pessimism. And he had a very dark, that we never reach satisfaction. But he was saying the journey to attempt it is noble and dignified. And I could understand that. So philosophy always was a source of light, just as art was for me.